Hi, I'm Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research. I am talking today with Dr. Jeffrey Kaye, a retired psychologist who practiced in San Francisco. He has worked professionally with torture victims and asylum applicants. After 9/11, he joined others in protesting the activities of psychologists in the CIA and Department of Defense, some of whom helped develop interrogation programs widely exposed as including torture and other forms of cruel treatment of prisoners. Dr. Kaye subsequently wrote the nonfiction ebook Cover Up at Guantanamo. He has published articles on torture and other subjects at Truth Out, The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and numerous other online websites. Dr. Kaye and I discuss his research and findings, including his January 17th article titled The Unknown Story of CIA's MK-DECOY and Subproject 61. Find links in the video description to his work, which contain links to the records discussed today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Kaye.
Hi, thanks. Thanks very much, Jack. Happy to be here.
Well, good. I continue to appreciate the work you do. It's well cited, it's salient. You cover topics of interest and particularly human rights and related issues. And you've been showing things that happened during the Cold War and providing sources, lots of FOIA records and things like that. And then you tie that into how it continues to apply today to the intelligence agencies, medical profession, all kinds of things. And I really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So your latest article, The Unknown Story of CIA's MK-DECOY and Subproject 61, you published that January 17th, and it's about the CIA studying a covert concussion-inducing device and changes to the brain that correlate between cases of brain damage and interrogation. I'll just let you try to give people a general overview.
Right. Well, this, as I explained in the article, I came across these CIA projects, which were part of the larger MKULTRA program that the CIA ran from 1953 to, arguably the early 70s. I would argue they never really gave it up. But we're looking at that period. And because there were a few things about Guantanamo and the post 9/11 CIA torture program, which had been written about extensively in the press, and I'm sure all your listeners are aware of these, at least somewhat of what went on in these facilities. But a couple of things nagged at me, like threads that I was pulling at, and this is what came out. The documents that I drew the material from have been sitting out there on servers, CIA servers, or other Department of Defense, et cetera, for decades now. The fact that nobody has looked at them or bothered to interpret them is itself kind of startling. It is a kind of meta topic of the articles as well. I mean, I don't really go into it except for maybe a paragraph, but it's important because why am I writing about this in 2025 when these things have been sitting around for literally decades? Well, the reason was there were two, the CIA and the Department of Defense enhanced interrogation programs, which were ostensibly based on techniques of mock torture used at training camps for the Department of Defense. and the CIA, as it turned out, I discovered later. But and that these were reverse engineered, people say, but these were used as the basis for waterboarding and slamming and sticking people in confinement boxes, etc., slamming them up against the wall. That were the so-called enhanced interrogation program, in combination with other things that really these entities had been doing for a long time, such as use of stress positions, sleep deprivation, and solitary confinement, and other things. What bothered me was that the two paradigmatic figures used by the CIA and the DoD, Abu Zubaydah, who hopefully many of your readers have heard about, who the guy with the eye patch, who was supposedly the guy who John Kiriakou, who's been interviewed many times, helped capture in the early days after 9/11 in Pakistan, I believe it was. And another figure by the guy by the name of Mohammed al-Qahtani, who was rumored to be the sixth hijacker, or whatever. He was supposed to be one of the 9/11 hijackers, but wasn't. It was a rendition to Guantanamo. Both of these figures had histories, medical histories of serious brain damage. I mean, really serious brain damage, the kind of thing that causes you to have seizures, that cause long-term amnesia from the injuries, and other medical consequences. And I thought to myself, what are the chances that the two primary figures used to set off and study their new torture program both had serious brain damage issues, which it turned out they did know about on some level. And then there's another logical question that flows from that. If you're assuming that you're a CIA guy or a Department of Defense guy, and you're really interested in these new forms of interrogation protocols, yes, okay, maybe they're torture, but the president says they're not, so we can use them. And you want to see if they work. You're not going to test them on people. You're not going to try them out first on people who have serious damage to their brain, because you cannot generalize to the population, because most people did not have histories of serious brain damage. So it just made no sense that they would choose these particular people. And it never in my wildest dreams until recently, when I came across these documents, did I think that they were doing this in part to, or perhaps even in large part, so that they would be able to have a control group or a control subject to compare other people with. Who were those other people? Well, there was one other thing that bothered me about Guantanamo, and that was the fact, something I came across many years ago now and have written about and tried to get other people interested in, and very frustratingly have not been able to, which was the fact that at a high-level meeting of medical officials in February of 2002, only weeks after Guantanamo was opened, this meeting was of a board that's now been, the board doesn't exist anymore. It's called the Armed Forces Epidemiological Board. It was an oversight board, included people from the CDC and the Department of Defense and other medical officials, Surgeon General kind of representative, I think, where they would talk medical issues that as they were coming up in the Department of Defense. And they had a presentation at this meeting by an admiral's aide who was a captain. Captain Yund was his name. And he later spoke to and verified that he, in fact, did say what it recorded him as saying. And he said that people had died from the injuries that they had arrived with at Guantanamo. And we know from other sources that people were sent from the battlefields, renditioned, that, whatever that is, 8,000 miles. I don't know how far it is from Afghanistan to Guantanamo, right off the battlefield, seriously injured. And has been, Karen Greenfield and others have written about, how some of the people who arrived at Guantanamo needed major surgery right away. It was touch and go, and they had to they flew in specialists to do surgery at Guantanamo. So what bothered me on this too was, and it bothers me that no one else has asked these questions either. Why would you take it? Why would you fly somebody all the way across the world when you could treat them first? You could fly them later, but why would you fly them if they needed major surgery from a battlefield wound? Why would you fly them halfway around the world to do it at a place where you didn't even have the proper medical facilities? Now, some people think that, well, they do that just because they're heartless, or they do it just because they're moral monsters, and perhaps that is true. But most things happen for a reason. What was the reason that they wanted people from the battlefield? Now, I don't really know the reason, but I speculate, again, from the things, listeners might be going, what did he talk about? What are these things? But from the brain damage studies that the CIA was doing and the kinds of research they were doing during the Cold War, that they needed to have people, perhaps even fresh cadavers. If people read this article, they'll see that part of the research they did was to experiment with fresh cadavers on brain damage that they were doing. And to think that that's the reason is, again, it's pretty macabre, as I say in the article. But the entire subject we're about to talk about here today is pretty dark. Creating a device to induce repeated concussions in people from a distance is to do it silently and quickly and efficiently and with the right amount of scientifically judged optimum impact to create amnesias or to prepare these people or for interrogation, which is what they write about in their documents for MK-DECOY, name of the program, is very dark. And it did come up at congressional hearings back in 1977. The curtain lifted for a moment, and it was discussed for a little bit. And a Republican senator by the name of Richard Schweiker briefly took the CIA to task for trying to cover up or minimize this work. People can read the back and forth in the article, but so it was out of just to finish my thought, it was out of these anomalous occurrences around the CIA and Department of Defense torture programs after 9/11 that sent me looking through old documents to see, could I find anything, in the case of Zubaydah and Qahtani, anything that the CIA was doing at all around that had to do with brain damaged individuals. And lo and behold, it really didn't take me long. It was once I had formed the question and knew what I was looking for, the answer came up on my computer search within minutes. It was there all along, but no one had thought to ask. And what came up first for me was the CIA MKUltra Subproject 54, otherwise known as Project MK-DECOY. When MK, for your listeners, if they don't know MKUltra, MK-DECOY, others have been are out there, MK Naomi, MK Search,
Delta, yeah,
MK Delta, MK Off. These were all, the MK prefix meant that they were coming from the CIA's Technical Services Division, that was the branch of the CIA that these projects were in. The Technical Services Division, or Technical Services Support Services, is now today known as the Office of Technical Research, OTR. And it was in fact, as I was the first to note, even before the Senate Select Committee came out, was the part of the CIA that worked on that controlled MKUltra for the most part. And in fact, in a 2005, 2006, but it wasn't declassified until maybe 5 years ago now, memoir by the CIA's, the head of the CIA's Office of Medical Services, OMS, which had serviced the black sites from a medical standpoint, sent their doctors there, did a memoir about the program, fairly critical memoir. And one of the things that that official said was that the people in charge were very interested in exchanged papers about MKUltra and the kind of things going on. So I wasn't, not only was I not wrong, it was finally, I had picked up on something that looked pretty definite to anyone who knew the background of these programs. And they verified that there was interest, and they were, perhaps, they didn't say it, but the implication is they were working around issues that were similar to MKUltra, which is today discussed as a mind control program, and is best known for its use of drug, LSD, slipping LSD to unwitting subjects, people visiting prostitutes, famously in Operation Midnight Climax, and all of this stuff. In fact, I think it was at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, and was it ProQuest or whatever, came out a few months ago, made a big splash for themselves, saying, "Oh, we have all these. We've put together a website where you can look at all these documents about MKUltra." But it was really a rehash of the same old stuff that's been out there ever since Jonathan Marks published The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which went over his FOIA material that he received in the mid-1970s on MKUltra. And they didn't really add anything to it. And that's just the way it's been. I believe that this article that I wrote is the first major addition to our understanding of MKUltra, or at least aspects of MKUltra, that has been made in many, many years. And another meta aspect to this article is, why is that? MKUltra spent millions and millions of dollars. It involved dozens and dozens of sub-projects. And when I say sub-project, it makes it sound small, like it's sub, it's lesser. These were major research enterprises, most of them, not all of them, but many of them. I haven't counted how many were. But so, for instance, we have this Subproject 54 known as MK-DECOY. But if Subproject 61 is the other program that I write about in the article. It also was about researching brain damage and comparing brain damage subjects to, psychotic subjects, to depressed people, to people in situations of extreme stress, such as those who were under interrogation. And it really was a proper follow-up study to the work they were doing earlier about inducing brain damage. Now they're going to study all the different ways in which the brain could be damaged, either via stress, by lesions to the brain, by concussions, by brain damage. And I believe they were using they themselves say they wanted to use this material so that they could develop forms of frustrating the ways in which people adapt to stress, knowing, of course, that they would cause brain damage. And of course, one problem if you want to cause brain damage to people and they're under interrogation is you can cause too much brain damage. They're not going to give you information, or even if you don't want the information, the other major reason that you torture people is so that you can exploit them in other ways for the intelligence field. You turn them into double agents. You make them informants. You put them on as a show trial. They, confess to all the terrible things they did. Oh yeah, Al Qaeda's terrible. Did you hear this guy said? Yeah, we were gonna drop bombs on the Brooklyn Bridge or something like that.
Right. One of the objectives in the Cold War research in these projects that I noted from your article was that the CIA showed interest in that people who suffered from concussions typically had amnesia preceding when it happened. Do you think we're talking about Manchurian Candidate stuff here, that tied in?
Possibly, very possibly. It is, of course, of interest that, people with brain damage are, and I should have put this in the article, are more susceptible, or at least there was research done to see if they were more susceptible to hypnosis. As people who were drugged. Anybody whose brain functioning is suppressed for whatever, due to injury, due to drugs, the CIA looked to see if that made them more susceptible to hypnosis. Now, along with the MKUltra programs was another program that was very specifically about using interrogation or other methods to control assets. It was called Project Artichoke, and this is where the whole Manchurian Candidate thing really comes into play, because what they were doing was trying to induce amnesia. They wanted to make agents induce amnesia in people. And there were many reasons for this. One is if you have an agent and they're caught, and they're going to talk and spill everything they know under perhaps coercive interrogation or torture or skilled interrogation, whatever it may be. If you could induce them to have amnesia, then they couldn't say anything. And if you can induce that, so people.
If I literally don't know my mission, then I can't tell you. Right.
That's right, because you've lost memory of it, either because of hypnotic suggestion or perhaps somebody from a distance. So there's MK-DECOY was, perhaps from a distance, we can send a very quick blast of sound precisely some area on your skull, and we will cause a concussion, cause amnesia in you for some period of time, whatever that is, not permanently, but for some period of time. So Sirhan, who people have pointed to, I know Lisa Peace's book on RFK assassination goes into this a great deal about, use of hypnosis on him and creating a kind of programmed assassin, if you will. And they don't have to really be a good assassin. They just need to be near the place where the assassination is taking place so that you can have
influenceable. Yes.
Yeah, you can have either an assassin or you can have a what's the word for it? A patsy.
Yeah.
And he, interestingly enough, for another guy, I was looking at some material recently, and this is not written down anywhere, but he's been looking at Jack Ruby, and that whole Ruby's whole thing in the assassination, man who killed Oswald, and I noted, what were Ruby's motives was a huge, for the people who are interested in JFK assassination. That's one of the areas of controversy, and I don't really know. I have nothing definite to say, but I will note that Ruby also had history of significant brain injuries that had occurred because he had been in fights. He'd been hit over the head, etc., and had been in an automobile accident. So whether that goes anywhere, I don't know. But it's just all of these people it starts to be too coincidental. Sirhan, by the way, was had been a jockey and had been thrown from a horse and had been hospitalized with head injury. How much and how important all this is still remains to be seen, but it is clear now that the CIA thought it was important and that they were looking at it and they wanted to cover it up.
Another brief aside, it was, you mentioned John Marks and his groundbreaking search for the Manchurian Candidate. It was there that I believe I first read that director of the CIA, Allen Dulles' son, sustained brain injury in Korea during the war. And that Marx supposed was a lot of Dulles' motivation for working with Dr. Wolf and MKUltra at Cornell and the New York hospitals, which ties right into the work you're doing. There's a couple things too about public awareness, like you're aptly pointing out that even the MKUltra, for lack of a better term, research community, or people who are aware of it, tend to gravitate towards the LSD and the some of the more commonly accepted aspects of it, for lack of a better term. But as you point out in your article, this became known with John Marks and the Rockefeller Commission and the Church Committee that released a report. But do you feel that overall the general public, even now, really has an awareness of some of the things that the CIA was doing in these areas during the Cold War?
No, I don't think they do. And even the best, part of that is just because there's only very few people have really been truly researching this. And in any one single individual really can't grasp, or maybe not grasp, but really doesn't have the time or the wherewithal to make the totality of this program uh, evident to its readers or its listeners. And that's because the program was so vast. Every new time I go into this subject area, which really you could have an entire university department that was only researching and only had courses on MKUltra, and you could have a 4-year program, and you still probably would not be able to take in the totality of everything that was done, even if it was declassified. Maybe especially if it was declassified, because there's so much material there. Just in this recent article, Dr. Shirley Aquimbi, famous physicist, professor emeritus at Columbia University, obviously worked closely with the CIA, and he worked on the concussion devices. This is a man who had a obituary in the New York Times, right?
Yes, these were not outlying criminal figures. These
Right.
were leading academics.
Right.
They were the heads of the Canadian Psychiatric Association,
Right.
the AMA. These were not obscure, shadowy personnel.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So no. But on the other hand, I will say people have it's been out there enough, and there's been movies, and so people have a general sense that MKUltra was this very evil thing. The men who talked with, the men who killed or stared down goats or whatever that movie in the book.
Yeah.
That weird experiments occurred. They kind of, if they're cognizant of anything, they know something about, of course, the drugs, but they also, I think, understand that they don't know the totality of it. It's just this huge gray area of evil. The doctors are evil, the material is evil, and they're not wrong. It is evil.
Right.
But
right.
Even the best book written recently on MKUltra was Stephen Kinzer's book, Poisoner in Chief, which concentrated mainly on the life and of Sidney Gottlieb, who was the guy in charge of MKUltra, or at least he was the hands-on scientist guy, chemist, and everything, and a very interesting person. And Kinzer does a great job describing him and aspects of the program, but he did not appear to be aware of, or he left it out, but I doubt he left it out. I think he just didn't know, because you can't study everything. There's nothing in that book about MK-DECOY or the brain damage research. It's just not there, even though there's lots that's very important in that book. So I don't think anybody can. You just mentioned something that I could have brought up. You had Alan Dulles and the son, and how Dr. Harold Wolf had treated him, and the connections between that and MKUltra. All very true. And but it's just the whole thing is just massive. And all I've tried to do here was uncover one more little area, not little, one more area that I think is important, and that may, it's very speculative, but nevertheless may help us understand certain aspects of what's happening in the present or has happened recently. Another area of speculation in the article is about the Havana Syndrome, and whether or not that had any relationship to the kind of research done on concussion-making devices from afar, and people with, because these Havana Syndrome victims were, many of them apparently had been described as having post-concussive syndrome. concussions, as it turned out, if I, I'm not a neurologist, although I have some background. I was a clinical psychologist, as trained, PhD, and I did take some coursework in neuropsychology, but I hadn't realized that concussions themselves aren't as definitive in terms of um, making an examination determining that someone has a concussion as I thought, at least upon things such as brain scans or MRIs even. Whatever the brain is a highly complex organ, and a lot of the difficulties that there's still controversy to this day is how much of what goes on in the brain is localized to sections of the brain versus the global operations of the brain. That even to this day are controversial and not totally understood. So a lot of this stuff touches research that is I still am learning about myself, but I didn't have any CIA scientists to consult. I did. Oh, this was something different. You were talking before the beginning about, or I was talking to you outside of this, perhaps about a program that the CIA had to commit people who were perhaps potentially dangerous to them in terms of presenting dangers of giving up information or revealing sources and methods, etc. And they would involuntarily commit them. And to the VA or St. Elizabeth's Hospital. I mean, they had a formalized agreement, right, with these, which I wrote about in another article. But
yeah, if I might interject quickly, please. He is referencing now his October article titled CIA Connected DC Hospital Chief Advised Warren Commission. And that is another recommended one.
There were, psychiatrists working for the CIA
committing people.
And these were, they were committing people.
It certainly is there for the taking, so to speak, that if an agency has the authority to commit people for matters of what it's calling national security, that it doesn't want them talking, it doesn't want them sharing things. Mm-hmm. The same reason Mr. Is it Zubaydah? Is that how you pronounce? Yeah, right. Is his attorneys argue that he's continuing to be held not because he is a dastardly criminal, but because he knows what the CIA did in Guantanamo Bay. If you want to hold people for reasons like that, and you're also conducting unethical experiments, well, then, yeah, one would kind of just go hand in hand with the other of the kind of subjects you need, it would seem to me.
Right. Well, in the current article about MK-DECOY, I do quote the cable from 2002, I believe it was, CIA cable, which they indicate they can never let Abu Zubaydah go. The man has never been charged. He's been in prison.
Right, forever prisoner, right.
Yeah, he's a forever prisoner. There are only a dozen or so prisoners left at Guantanamo. He's one of them. He's been cleared for release, I believe. In any case, there's nothing against him. Why is this man not walking free? And I don't believe, and they say he can never be let go. I think it also means they can never see his body. I don't think, anything can ever happen in which people can get a hold of him and try and understand what was going on. Why are these things so secret? Right? What could it possibly be? Well, perhaps it's things as dark as I've been talking about here.
You mentioned earlier that you'd read it and you'd think about it, and I really relate to that. I'll read the records, and as I talk about, sometimes there's an art even to reading this stuff, because it's not like a magazine. It doesn't give you italics or headlines. It's typically just pages of walls of text. And it takes a while to read it multiple times to get a familiarity and see the flow of it. And I can really relate. I'll sit there thinking, why did they do that? What, and why would they note this? And what were they doing? And sometimes my conclusion will just be, I don't know. Like I don't think these were unintelligent people. They were not uneducated people, and I don't know what they were doing. And along those lines, there is a certain comedy factor that has been given to the CIA that I think they enjoy the use of at times, like Peter Falk and Serpentine, and Men Who Stare at Goats. And the New Yorker had a piece a few years ago that balanced that well with the insanity of a man coming to work and finding 500,000 doses or something like that of LSD in a drum in his office, and a few days later it was just gone, and things like that. And I think there's something to be said for that. Like, I think that some of it is just madness. And I think some of it was drug induced madness, you know, like Gottlieb dosing people without their knowledge. I think some of it was just crazy. But I'm also thoroughly convinced some of these men were very, very clever and competent as well. And sometimes we just don't know what we're looking at in these documents.
Right, right. Yeah, they, you know, certainly they were very concerned with secrecy and covering things up, and and one of the things that struck me when you read a lot of documents is that how they lie within the organization. In other words, these are need to know situations, and if you're running a covert program that's highly classified, that means other people in the CIA don't know about it, and they may be called upon to deal with something as a result, or blowback, or some aspect of that program, or maybe they're even talking to a congressional committee, and they truly don't know. Hence, the Hall of, that Wilderness of Mirrors example. A lot of these things are done for counterintelligence purposes as well, and they're trying to seek out and figure out who's a security leak within the agency. So false stories are sent out, and you don't know if that document you're reading includes some of that. It's it takes a long time. It's another reason perhaps why people, why we don't know still so much. It's a daunting task to look at these documents. You have to perversely perhaps enjoy it to a certain extent. I see it as a big puzzle on some level, putting together a puzzle. And if you don't know what to look, again, the documents which I found, which literally lay out this program of creating a device, a small and silent device to create concussions, had been sitting on multiple different servers and sites that you could have read about it, from transcripts from congressional hearings to the CIA's reading room, from FOIA documents, etc. But nobody had ever looked at it. I mean, that again is strange, but in science, in knowledge in general, that's how things are. If you don't know what you're looking for, you oftentimes don't see it. I think this is what happens, why you have to read documents many times. You pick up and then later something makes sense.
Yeah. I liken it to a grant proposal, because I've done some grant writing. I have to read it multiple times to start seeing the flow and what I think they're getting at among all of the jargon, And absolutely, there's a talent to reading this stuff. And like, if they bothered to note this and send it to the director of the agency, there's some purpose. Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little about how they may have done this. Now, Induced concussions, and
Mm-hmm.
we've been talking about what the
Mm-hmm.
purposes may have been. You
Mm-hmm.
wrote in your recent article, it may have been done, or you were writing about their work, that the
Right.
CIA was writing, that it could be done possibly electronically or with sound waves. And they used a 2,500 square foot laboratory.
Mm-hmm.
And the document goes on to note that 3 blast test series were run, and it also described a special blackjack device that was, quote, a pancake type blackjack giving a high peak impact force with a low unit surface pressure, end quote.
Right.
Then we go on to see that CIA records talked about possibly using a concealed or camouflaged spring-loaded impacting device that would trigger upon contact with the head,
Mm-hmm.
an explosive pad detonated in contact with the head or body. And then, as you noted in the hearings, with congressional hearings and church committee, they talked out of both sides of their mouth about whether this was theoretical or actually came to pass, and then they tried
Right.
to address only what the CIA did, as if they weren't leapfrogging off of naval research that had already been
Mm-hmm.
done. And what was your thinking about how do they, let's say they've identified a subject, a person, and they
Mm-hmm.
have reason that they want to stress them, create a concussion.
Mm-hmm.
What does
Mm-hmm.
that look like to a field officer? How would he go about
Mm-hmm.
doing that possibly?
Well, we'd have to know what device they settled on, and as I read the material, it seems to me they were going through the iterations of the various things that they were thinking of. The pancake shaped, using my hand so it'd be flat. The pancake shaped blackjack on the head covers a wide, area. If I've never seen a blackjack except in a comic book, and but it's it's a small club looking device. It's heavy. It's got lead or whatever, and you hit it on the head, small, size of your fist or less, and it's going to make a mark on your head.
Right,
Um,
right.
a pancake shaped device is going to spread. They want it to be. They don't want they want it to be covert. They want it to be something that cannot be traceable or understood as to what actually occurred. So they started out with this is something we could do, maybe something that distributes the load of the hit on the head in such a way that you can't determine that exactly what happened. The spring-loaded device also might do the same thing, or maybe it would just make such a tiny little, sort of like, like if you flick your head with your finger, that kind of a thing, but of course with much greater power. And they thought that they could, create the equivalent. What happens is it resonates. The word resonance is in the article a number of times. It resonates in the head. It jars the brain or the neurons in your neocortex and shears them, causes damage. In the same way that if shaken baby syndrome, or a boxer gets brain damage because their head is whipped around, or in an automobile your head accident your head gets whipped forward and back, and that process shears and damages brain structures, brain neurons in the brain. So they went through all these different devices, the explosive pad, but then they talked at greater length about the idea of some kind of a tuned device, something that this would be the sound that would resonate with some frequency to which the brain or the body corresponds, so that they could send a sound blast. And this goes back to the work with the Navy, and why I think this is what they were most interested in, because the Navy's work was on blast concussions, right? By blast concussion, it means that you're sitting on as I hinted at in the article, you're sitting on a destroyer and a giant gun goes off, and yeah, you may be wearing, earmuffs, but the pressure wave itself is going to hit the skull, and that's causing concussions. to people on ships. And they still study this, as I pointed out, and I linked to some of the recent work. The Navy, this is an ongoing problem because they use big guns, and the blasts from big guns send waves through the air that impact whatever they touch, and that includes the brain, and that causes concussions. So their idea is if we can cause a concussion like that from afar in a smaller device that can create a blast concussion, or that can cause some kind of sound, and they said it would be loud, but it would only take a tenth of a second. That you only needed a tenth of a second to do this. That perhaps in a restaurant, a loud restaurant or whatever, if you have a victim over there and you want to do it, no one's going to notice real quick a noise that happens super fast and disappears. Meanwhile, you've done the damage. And the subject is now disoriented, and is having all the signs of a concussion, and they don't even know what's going on. They have amnesia in the moment. They don't even know what's happening. That's what I think they were trying to do. Whether they ever operationalized or created such a device, we don't know. They certainly worked on it. What they did is, of course, as most of your listeners might know, but it's worth saying here because some may not, is that when the MKUltra projects came to light in the early 70s, and particularly in the Rockefeller report and in the church committee hearings that were coming out, and it was leaking out from columnist Jack Anderson, was the first to reveal the name of the program, MKUltra. They destroyed Gottlieb and the head of the CIA, Holmes, or whatever, got together, and they just supposedly thought they were destroying all the tens of thousands of pages of documents the CIA had. It was a gigantic security risk, and but they weren't able to destroy everything, apparently. Well, not just apparently, we know they didn't, but they destroyed the vast majority, and we don't know what happened. So. Whereas in my article, a good portion of it on the part on Subproject 61 discusses the finances and the structure is set up from the financial documents left from that project. I unfortunately I have not, very little anyway on that, on MK-DECOY. I presume that it was destroyed. The CIA said, we just canceled the project. But they don't even have there should be a document saying that it was canceled, and there is no such document.
Right.
Maybe they destroyed that too. Seems to me they wouldn't have destroyed that, but who knows? Anyway, we just don't know. But their interest in these issues persists, and maybe they did create it, or maybe they found that it was not as helpful as they thought. But it's something that awaits further discovery, I guess.
Right. So you've documented that these projects happened. They were interested in learning more about inducing concussions and inducing stress that caused emotional distress. And they were correlating that with people that had brain damage. So they needed subjects with brain damage to look at. And that seems that it's plausible it may have continued in the same, the continuing divisions of CIA on through the ages. And where I'm headed with this is way back in the Cold War, you identified that there were CIA medical personnel funded by the CIA that identified changes in spinal fluid of people with brain damage as compared to people that didn't have that brain damage.
Right.
And how did that come to their attention, and why were they concerned about this?
Well, they wanted to understand the mechanisms of brain damage. They wanted to understand the mechanisms of the effects of all sorts of violations of the bodily organisms' defenses so that, because out of that knowledge would come, just like would come how they could create new weapons or how they could create new defenses, perhaps against certain weaponry. They believed that neural weapons were a possibility. They themselves worked on them. They certainly knew about the use of drugs as weapons, so to speak, and the world of brain damage and inducing brain damage, and they did have access. So Project 61, they did comparative studies in which they had hundreds of brain damaged individuals, 250 in one group of brain damaged individuals. They looked at brain damage that was that had to do with lesions, meaning, lesions on the neocortex, which is what we think of usually when we look at the brain, all those curvy gyruses, and versus people who had brain damage in other parts of the brain, either subcortical perhaps or on the brain stem. So they were doing comparison studies, and they compared them to people who had been labeled schizophrenic. They compared them to people who were, were just depressed. So out of this knowledge, they could derive what the feasibility of weaponry or directions to take weapons research or device research. That's what I think that was about. So they looked at the spinal fluid too. Of course, they were going to see were there things that they could use to identify the effects of the stress on the nervous system
The
as a whole.
success of the project. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they even claim that, perhaps they could find a way to make people immune. If they were constructing a concussion making device, so perhaps were the Soviets or the Chinese or whoever. We need to find a way to protect our people against getting covert concussions. And we will do this because we'll shoot a bubble of air into their spinal cord, which will expand and protect them somehow against the certain kinds of enzymes that are produced by the body in these cases, and neurokinin, and they didn't just do research on people. They did research on animals, again, cadavers. They constructed they used glass flasks which would hold material as stand-ins for the brain, and apparently even constructed a glass skull which could be
Right.
used to simulate neurological material in the head. They did all sorts of bizarre things. They gave cats catatonic states by injecting into into the brain or the intracerebral spaces, various kinds of materials based on the things they were finding in the spinal fluid of humans, and perhaps the spinal fluid of cats. I didn't go into it that in great detail, but it's bizarre, really bizarre stuff. If people think looking at researching on goats is weird, imagine, trying to create brain damage in cats.
Yeah.
Sick,
Yeah.
sick stuff.
Like I'm looking here, you quote one of the project goals: to evaluate these reactions to see what extent frustration adaptation can be prevented, postponed, modified, and predicted. And that to me kind of spells out the wider situation with Cold War CIA and MK Ultra, any and everything.
Yeah.
Whatever we can find that it's useful for, weapons
Hmm.
research and development. If we can keep our soldiers from getting traumatized in battle, we'd like to know how to do that. And if we can traumatize their soldiers further, we'd sure like to know how to do that. And so sometimes when I read this stuff, I'll think they didn't necessarily know where they were headed as much as they were looking for information that would give them direction. But with what you've got here, they seem pretty soundly on a path by the time they were making those memos you got.
Yes, definitely. And they couch it in scientific sounding terms, but frustration tolerance, what is that? That is the
Right.
ability of a human being to handle frustration, which we need that ability and we use it every single day, right? Um, and if you can't handle frustration, people who are traumatized, seriously traumatized, people who have brain damage, people who are just, some of the research they did was on how people with just physical ailments like peptic ulcers, people who had colostomies, people with physical problems, anyone who's had pain, for instance, chronic pain knows, or even if it's just temporary, how, continual pain, even at a not minimal, but a lower level over time can wear you down and makes you less able to tolerate frustration. And that frustration can be, the sound, a neighbor who's maybe a little bit too loud, or I'm hungry. People say I'm hangry, right? Well, because what does that mean? It means that your ability to tolerate the frustration of feeling hungry is starting to wear thin. So I'll say I'm hangry. Well, so I don't want to overdo it, but it's everywhere. It's global. And so this is an attack really on the basic functions, the basic psychological operations that we go through every day. And frustration is just one, tolerance is just one. The article spells out some of the others, in which, but they singled in on this. And in fact, if you think about it, that's a good deal. If you look at what they did at Guantanamo, and when we have some understanding of this, the whole idea was to put people in strange environments. They moved people around. You know, the stress of being in a new environment also wears a person down. And if you constantly, move people around, their ability to tolerate that and all of this is about breaking down individuals so that you can exploit them. And by exploit them, I mean get information from them, plant information in them, to give, so they can, to use them as informants. Almost every person who we have a story from Guantanamo says at some point the government came and said, we want you to work for us, right? They were trying, their best to, get people to be double agents, to squeal on other people in the prison, um, to exploit people. They put them on trial.
Yeah,
Um,
the term, I'm sure you're familiar with it. They evolved to learned helplessness
Right.
was,
Learned helplessness
yeah,
is an attack on the nervous system primarily, on this, which you submit to somebody to so much frustration that their ability to tolerate, just breaks down. At that point, that paradigm was developed experimentally by psychologists, on animal models. And it was just one way. I did so many different ways and approaches to think about the problems that the CIA was using. Primarily, yes, they want to control, predict. Science itself, if you take a course about the scientific method, it says we want to control and predict. And that's what, and that's put forth as a good thing. And it is a good thing if what you're trying to do is say, control how often, certain things happen so that we can predict them and then we can intervene or create an intervention so that doesn't happen. But if you're using it to control people, then that takes on a whole other ethical dimension.
yes, it does. And I recently had the opportunity to speak with former Guantanamo prisoner Mansour Dafi, and he brought up the Seton Hall paper, America's
Hmm.
Battle Lab.
Right.
And yeah, in that, they point out that not only were they monitoring vital signs and stress and a number of things that indicated experimentation, but just common sense is after years of captivity and torture, what actionable intelligence could this subject possibly have for you?
Right.
And as you point out in your work, Mr. Al-Qahtani was suffering from mental illness to the extent that it's rather absurd to think he could have been confused with an architect of 9/11 even.
Right, right. The fact, you know, I think if I was going to, if there was any one thing that set me off down this path in terms of this subject, it was the fact that they hid for so long um, that Al-Qahtani had a mental illness and that he had had serious brain damage history. Why, you know, that had never come up, you know, in years and years of discussions. Finally, it came out. I think one of the people examining him for the defense, a psychiatrist, I think, unearthed that information and put it into a report that later was declassified, or she spoke about it perhaps at a hearing. However, it finally came out. This was years and years after he'd already, you know, been. I think it was even after he had been the convening authority at Guantanamo admitted that he had been tortured, which was a first um, you know, admission by the U.S. government that anybody had been tortured at Guantanamo. Uh, you know, I don't know. The whole thing is so strange. You know, this is one of the darkest articles in the past week or so, and I've had some difficulty, I think, um, psychologically or emotionally handling all of the bulk of all of this, because what it tells me is that, excuse me, is that so much of what the government has done has just been so criminal. And all we have to do is look at the news today, and of course, we can see it in so many other ways, whether it's the support of genocide, you know. I think our society as a whole, you asked me, do people understand about MK Ultra? I wonder if they even understand about the US government and the totality of the crimes that it has done, or the massive aspects of its projects of psychological operations. These are things you've written about, you know, and you know, so, that are hard to take in because again, it's so big. I mean, you spend billions of dollars on something over the years, that project, yeah, is going to be huge, and the ability to take it all in um, is not easy. And the darker it becomes, the more that you want to just look away.
What I found is that the general public at large does not understand the foundations of emotional trauma and behavior modification. And it's almost built in to deny this until there's a point that you have a reason to need to know it. You know, like there's a certain level of denial of the, you know, the whole nature versus nurture argument. And understandably, people aren't walking around going through their normal lives, typically giving a lot of thought to this. And so there needs to be some at least fundamental understanding of conditioned behavior and things like that, and how emotional trauma can unconsciously cause our actions and steer our likes and dislikes and all these kinds of things, to understand why an intelligence agency would become so invested in wanting to do it deliberately. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think people have that groundwork a lot of the time. Would you
Mm-hmm.
agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's almost a corollary in some ways of the lack of scientific understanding in general that people have about all sorts of things. So certainly in terms of, you know, but even the professions themselves, you know, it's interesting. I was reading these documents and I said, wow, the CIA, they really, I'm thinking about, say, NFL football and the concussion controversies and stuff like that. that have been going on the past, say, 10 to 20 years. But in fact, way back in the 1950s, you can read in these documents in my article, they well understood the impact of concussions. They understood, how deleterious they were. They compared them to people, being imprisoned and, or being schizophrenic, and here's the damage that concussions can cause was well understood by the military, the CIA. What took so long for that to percolate through to the average football fan or a football player or the coaching staff of an NFL team? They were writing about these substances, say, that were in the spinal fluid of individuals, was kind of cutting edge, because of course they had top scientists working with them. But if I went back and looked at, and I did go back and look, this didn't really make it into the article much, but to scientific papers written about these substances, a lot of the stuff they were writing about, they were ahead of they were at the edge of the wave. They were, they had the top scientists, and it really, one thing that's of interest is the CIA, though, did try to publish, that it's an interesting aspect of what they're doing, is that because these people were, the head of say a neurology department, or they were publishing in, medical journals and psychological journals. I mean, these guys had reputations, and they are, shall we say, have big egos. Anyway, they didn't want to work on this stuff if they couldn't make something of it. And the CIA, from themselves, a portion of their way they thought about it is that they too were adding to human knowledge, albeit dark knowledge, but they were adding to this too. And how they had planned, this is in the article, to publish a big book out of it, that would talk about their brain research. It wouldn't be in their names, of course, it would have been published under the names of the scientists. And this would have been above ground, and they would have taken out anything that was too classified, of course. They did this on on MKUltra in general. There was an article, a book called which you can look for online, and you can download the entire book, called The Manipulation of Human Behavior. It has articles by Harold Wolff, his associate Lawrence Hinkle, both of them working at Cornell for this, and working really also for the CIA. Articles on hypnotism, on drugs. The name of the book says it all: The Manipulation of Human Behavior. And
I was going to say Martin Orr's probably in there, because the hypnotism guys published a lot. And
he writes
I
the
think
chapter
he was
on
like,
hypnotism.
nobody pays attention to me anyway, so I might as well publish it. Yeah.
So they publish this stuff. So they're proud of it on some weird level. And I remember there's a guy by the name of Donald Hebb. He was a Canadian researcher. He worked at the same hospital as Cameron did, Donald Cameron in Montreal. But Hebb was a psychologist. Yeah, McGill. Hebb worked in the psychology department. Cameron was in the psychiatry and medical. He was more medical. And Hebb was working on sensory deprivation work. And he argued with way back when he argued with his controllers in CIA, how he didn't want this stuff to be classified. He wanted to publish. He wanted it to be out there, to be knowledge. Hebb, by the way, is a very interesting individual, not just because he was a top scientist working for the CIA, but his discoveries about the brain were very important. The sensory deprivation work, which CIA heavily subsidized and was interested in, showed how the brain was adapted via evolutionarily adapted, shall we say, to need sensation, and that without that sensation, without a certain level of sensory input, the nerves would die, or they would become dysfunctional. This is the physiology behind sensory deprivation and the effects of it that could be that are for many people deleterious. Anyway, that was very important. That was a finding that that he made on his own, but that the CIA took up, and they were constricting that knowledge. And I believe this has been written about. I think, oh gosh, what's his name? Wrote A Question of Torture. Al McCoy. think, wrote about this in one of his books about torture, the Heb story, and other scientists. So wherever you look, so I say, to me, wherever you look, at least in the 50s and 60s, at top scientists, there seems to be some kind of way, whether it's not just psychology and this stuff. The same thing in my research on biological weapons and looking at the episode in which the U.S. Tested use of biological weapons during the Korean War. That in that project too, similar to the MKUltra stuff, it began during World War II, really, and it continued, and they had recruited the top scientists in America, biologists,
Yeah, that's a whole
psychologists,
nother aspect.
physicists,
Yeah.
yeah, everybody, and they knew each other and they worked together was another thing. I think in one of my other articles, I think it was the one about MK. I think it's the one about MKUltra and the cover up of biological weapons in the Korean War. I'd seen that as far back as in 1949, the people working on Project Artichoke, came and revealed their work and talked about, talked about working on the unconscious of people and mind control stuff, and they presented this to a group of biologists working on biological warfare. And they even said to them, we haven't even told this to the FBI yet. So instead, but they did tell it to the secret committee working on biological weapons in the late 40s. These guys knew each other, and it's just mind blowing to me.
Yeah, it is. Like, one of the ways, for those of you that aren't aware, that Dr. Kaye and I first started comparing notes, we'd seen each other's work, and I of course respected his work and admired what he was doing. And I was researching the NICAP people and things like that, National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena. And one of them was a former CIA officer named Joseph Bryan. And his name showed up in a memo about the minutes of a meeting between Allen Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover and high level officials in Washington about the claims of prisoners of war, that confessions and the Manchurian candidate stuff about bioweapons, and were they really releasing them in Korea or not. And one of the things that struck me in this memo was that they just dropped his name and Brian's name and continued talking. And clearly he needed no introduction. Like, clearly everyone in the meeting is aware of the guy. And that is certainly one of the head scratchers that you're like, well, now what's that all about? And I've since come to learn that Joseph Bryan ran a psychological warfare crew and had a lot of influence in European newspapers and American newspapers, and even in Hollywood. So there may have been some things there like that. Yeah. But where I'm going with this is it all ties in to your work about the bioweapons and the cover up and what really happened. And you can't surgically separate all this stuff. Like you can't take General X, for lack of a better term, that ran the Army intelligence apparatus for 25 years and have him tell you, yeah, I wasn't read into that. It just doesn't work that way. It's all overlapping, and all the Venn diagrams connect at the higher levels is my interpretation.
Right. I was blown away when I saw that stuff on Bryant that you had written, because I had been, researching again the biowarfare stuff, and I had spent years trying to track down the information around these confessions from, high-ranking U.S. Air Force and Marine Corps officers who had been captured by North Korean Chinese forces, who had, planes had been shot out of the sky, and they were now POWs, and who 24 of whom approximately, confessed, and including the second highest ranking prisoner in the entire Korean War, Colonel Frank Schwabel, who was chief of staff to one of the major Air Force divisions, and had come out from Washington, D.C. to kind of implement some of the work that was being done there, and I think, in fact, to implement aspects of the now I believe to implement aspects of the biowar program. And anyway, I've been tracking that down. But one of the flyers was a guy by the name of Walker Mahurin, and he was an Air Force officer, a captain, and no, he's a colonel. Excuse me. He too was high level. He'd been an assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force. And then what was he doing out there? Anyway, in his own memoir, he mentions this guy Bryant and how he was a great friend of his. And then just before he went off to Korea, he had met with Bryant, and they had gone out on some sailing venture or something. So that's kind of interesting that this high-ranking guy. So yeah, and of course I believe that Bryant easily could have been involved in the cover-up as well, because that was a major effort. I only recently, I don't know if you ever saw that article, because if you don't have a set mind and you're open to just seeing where the documents are going to take you and see what reality is instead of what you hope it to be or wish it to be, then you come across some very interesting things. So for many years, for instance, I had believed originally that the men who had confessed had been tortured the way the New York Times told me and historians told me, and that's, you couldn't believe, these propaganda from the communists. And then until I finally tracked down the actual material that they confessed and said, oh, this is all quite believable. And I began to correlate things they said with what else was in the record, and it was all panning out. But why did they talk? Well, they still were under great stress. Anyway, I finally discovered the findings of a military inquiry that was made afterwards into why Frank Schwabel, this colonel, had spilled his guts about so many aspects of the program, and only to discover that it was this was in the New York Times, and it was that in fact the flyers who were sent on the germ warfare missions in Korea were told that if they were captured, they could talk. They could talk about the program if they had to. They didn't want them tortured. Now, so all that stuff about name, rank, and serial number, that wasn't true. Even Mahurin admitted it in his book. I was blown away. No one had ever said that before, ever. That meant it was a false equivalency to say, and this is what the Manchurian Candidate, of course, was all about. Search for the idea about Manchurian Candidate was that the communists, particularly the Red Chinese, had developed sinister methods of brainwashing in which you could control what a person would say and you could or do. And so they were just another term that was used afterwards was menticide. They had literally destroyed these people's brains and put in them these stories, these terrible stories about how America was dropping infected fleas and anthrax on China and North Korea. That was all a lie. And then later it was said, oh, they were tortured to say it or whatever, but it turned out they were told that they could say the truth about what the program was. And that's what they told us, the truth. And then that was classified right afterwards. It was just a brief period in 1954 where this came out during the inquiry into Frank Schwabel's. I still am trying to track down the trial record of Frank Schwabel, which isn't where it's supposed to be. I don't know if I can find it, but what I did find was the record of the inquiry's conclusions as to their investigation, and that was in the record. And there were a number of newspaper articles at the time that also reported on this, and I wrote this up. Like a lot of my other work, it never went anywhere, strangely to me. And I've written to many people, historians, other people, from these are important topics. But people don't want, a lot of these people either don't want to know, or perhaps they are already working with the intelligence field or the government on some level, or they wish to, and they see no future in pursuing these matters. I don't know.
They'd find it detrimental possibly to keeping relationships with certain officials they have,
Right.
that they get leads and
Yeah.
statements when they want them possibly. And
Yeah.
about men like Joseph Bryant and his colleagues, the people he worked with in the psychological warfare crew, even the top officers like Dulles and others. I think it's worth noting one of my interpretations is a lot of these men, I think, believed more than not that what they were doing was good. I think there are outliers like George White and others that sadist, sociopathic alcoholics made good men for the jobs sometimes.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that there was a CIA profile, if you will, that they wanted educated, cultured, moneyed people. And some of my research even showed that there were wealthy men that went calling, that went and asked the CIA, how do I help? What can I do? And of course, they found things for them to do. And I bring this up because I think sometimes we have, or I at least have, this idea of what dark, nefarious people, but they didn't view themselves as wearing black hats and creeping around in the shadows. I think a lot of them viewed themselves as in a important war against the Red Chinese, against the Russians.
Right.
And I think we're seeing that today. I mean, too, that there are people that I would disagree entirely with their interpretations of certain social circumstances and agendas that don't see themselves as evil. And I'm not headed to any moral point with this. Just it's an observation that J. Edgar Hoover wasn't walking around thinking he was doing something wrong. He was trying to hide, I don't think.
Right. Yeah. Robert J. Lifton, who was one of the psychologists working, or psychiatrists actually working with the government, and particularly around people who had collaborated with the communists during the Korean War, et cetera, and knew and went to meetings with all these MK-Ultra figures, wrote a book later in the 60s after he became an opponent of the Vietnam War and became alienated from the government. Anyway, his book was called The Nazi Doctors. And what he did was he went out and interviewed, some of these doctors who had done atrocities. And he found, they felt that way too. They did not see themselves as evil. They did not have remorse. And I'm reading a lot about Nuremberg right now. And it's true. These people do not have, for the most part, did not have remorse, at least in Germany. The Japanese scientists are different. Some of them did have remorse. That's another interesting topic. So some of this may be mediated by culture, perhaps. But the Germans, no, they didn't. And he speculated, he talked about splitting processes, which is a psychological term for how you can divide portions of the personality from itself, and you can do things, and some of this is, of course, is understood and can even be quite adaptive. So, for instance, a surgeon, working on you, let's say doing heart surgery, um, to do a bypass, is saving your life, and the surgeon sees himself as saving your life, but he's also doing things that in other contexts would be considered horrific, sawing open your chest, cutting into the skin, removing organs. Some of this stuff can be quite awful. And so you have to divide or split off the horror of doing that so that you can, for the service of whatever meaning you put onto it, which is a positive meaning. And I do think on some level that's what these people did. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Was discussing this with a friend of mine who's a historian one time, and I brought up the Apocalypse Now movie. And
Hmm.
I was saying, if you buy in to the war, well, then there's a certain reasonable line of thinking that to be the most atrocious at it is actually the intelligent thing to do. And he mentioned that something along the lines of um, all ultimate ideas like that, yes, have to be grounded in a false pretense in the first place, like a faulty premise to build it
Hmm.
to where then you've convinced yourself somehow that it's a matter of national security to chain up Muslim men and play blaring music 24/7, you know,
Yeah.
that just becomes
Well,
insanity.
at the end of it, to mention reference a different movie, Doctor Strangelove, you end up with General Jack D. Ripper, and you are the architect of the murder of countless millions of people because you believe you're doing the right thing. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
my work, if I went way back, I think what interested me in searching out a lot of this stuff was my inherent, long ago, I was, you know, was interested in the work of the eugenicists in the earlier 20th century in particular, and around Nazi Germany, of course, and race theory, and how these were terrible evils, and look what they had led to. And but a lot of these people, yeah, they thought that they were benefactors of humanity when really they were monsters. I think the greatest example of that is, bring it back to MK Ultra, was Dr. Cameron, you know, Cameron Sleeper, who did these horrific, nightmarish experiments on people. Um, uh, Again, if I look though, and I think about Unit 731, just to bring in another nightmarish topic, why not just dump them all in here? Where the Japanese doctors were working on biological weapons and stuff. They had some cognizance that what they were doing was wrong. And I think many in the CIA, oh, I did want to say this back when you were talking. What I've noticed is they will talk about, there are people who they would approach that did not want to work for them. Of course, we don't know their names, but they did have problems recruiting at times. And the biological weapons people, the same thing. So it's differential. There were people, as you say, who sought them out. I would love to work for you. I write, FBI files are full of people who write to the FBI saying, "Oh, I would like to do this. I want to volunteer. I want to snitch." The same for the government, the army. They were happy to work for the CIA or the military, but there were people who also didn't want to do this. Um,
yeah.
and
There's a famous, or not famous, but a part of John Marx's book that stands out to me, where he found a memo where a CIA officer told his supervisor that if you're trying to do this under the guise of a feasibility and defense study, it's pretty damn transparent. Yeah, and I thought that was that's kind of like saying too, you can leave me out of it, you know? Yeah,
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 yes, yeah, they did. It was a big surprise when I first started researching the biological weapon stuff. It was a surprise to the CIA that they approached people in the National Association of Science, people they had worked with before, like Devlov Bronk, these scientists who were well respected. And they wanted them to give opinions about how absurd the communist assertions were about the use of biological weapons. But they didn't do it. Or they put forth a mealy-mouthed thing that says, well, this is so mealy-mouthed, we can't even use it. They just refuse to do it. Or they, even the government's own guy in the army, one of the stories I read, I wrote that's out there about, some years ago, God, 10 years ago now, about a meeting of the psychological strategy board, and they were talking about this, and the army guy said, well, yeah, I did what you wanted, and I looked at the report of the International Scientific Commission led by Joseph Needham, and I have to say, you can't really scientifically fault it, but it's all propaganda. Well, even he couldn't bring himself to say it's scientific bunk. So there is a reality out there, and I don't know if there's anything that's inherently moral in the human psyche that is touched upon or should be touched upon when we talk about horrors, whether it's inducing concussions in people or even the whole project of trying to control people on a massive level, or to engage science for such dark purposes. In that book, the Manipulation of Human Behavior, its editor, Albert Biederman, has a quote at the beginning of the book saying, well, that's how science is. It can be, I wish I had the quote, I would give it, but sometimes, it can be used for good, and sometimes it can be used for evil. You just have to live with that. And in fact, if you think back to the beginnings of the Enlightenment, when science really began to make a big impact in the world, say in the late, during the night, the late 18th century, and early 19th century, I think Mary Shelley caught the dilemma very well in her book on Frankenstein, which was that you can use that science could be, had two faces, if you will. One was progress, knowledge, enlightenment, and the other was something monstrous, right? Terrible, destructive, inhuman. And that's where we are. And certainly the work that my article, my latest work, is about the inhuman part of it.
Yes, and there are many people who I see on social media saying that your work should be more widely distributed. If these same stories were presented by bigger news outlets, that they would be talked about widely and they would be considered really big deals. So I'd like to ask you your comments on that, how you feel about it, and especially now in the next foreseeable future, how do you feel that independent writers and journalists may shape the social media or not? How is that going to play out, do you think? And any related thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah. Well, on a personal level, I turned 70 recently, and I just don't have the energy. I think if I were a younger man and I had begun as a journalist or a historian, I would have a lot more energy to pursue getting my work out more. I might come up against, the same obstacles that I do now, but perhaps I would have been that persistence, and would have moved me farther. I do think that social media has helped someone like me. Um, I have had a few little breakthroughs. Al Jazeera published, back a number of years ago, my article, when the Senate report came out, and I was the person who wrote for them, and she pointed out the links to the MKULTRA and the Office of Technical Services, their place in all of this. And I've had a few other times in which my work has been either stolen, sometimes picked up by others and stolen, or for their own purposes, but in particular, it's been frustrating to me that my work about the biological warfare, which is doesn't really get much out there, and I do think that there is a concerted effort not to do that. In fact, I know that there is, and it's not aimed at me personally. It's just aimed at anybody who wants to break through. So I think I think so. The current thing where independent researchers can publish a book, now an ebook or even a paper book, and publish it and put it on Amazon or other platforms, or have access to multiple platforms to publicize that, or just write articles as I am at Substack currently, or previously at medium.com, or previously before that at some whatever websites, has helped, it's pushed, I think, and you yourself, if you utilize these things, I believe, has helped, and that's how I found, the stuff about Bryant, for instance. So it has opened a crack in the door, from the overt control of the ruling elite over these things. But there's the flip side of it is it's all quite diffuse. And lots of times you're just talking only to a small set of people who are the same people, and they may like your work, but it doesn't get out there the way the old style media used to do, where you're a newspaper, everyone read the newspaper because that was your source of news. So it's a mixed bag. There's probably always been a tension, I suppose, in terms of authors and finding their audiences, and being successful in these things. And it's certainly that we know that the government, their psychological operations divisions work hard to keep things from being known. And that includes sometimes, putting out partial revelations, so-called limited hangouts about various
Right.
items of importance. I don't know. I've talked about this a lot with Tom Powell, who's the son of John W. Powell, who wrote a book recently about his experience about both his family being persecuted in the 50s for exposing the biological warfare program, but also his own work researching that himself. And he put out, he couldn't find a publisher, including looking at, more left-wing and progressive publishers. Nobody wanted to publish it. So he self-published. So it's out there, and it's gotten a few book reviews, but again, so it's there. He says, well, we're planting seeds, Jeff. He's also, like I am now, in his 70s. And and I guess I guess I agree with him. All you can do is put out there what you have, and hope that you are planting seeds that others will pick up and continue my work, or elaborate upon it, or use it as the basis for their own work, which will be important in the months and years to come. At least I hope that happens.
Yes, it does happen. It already is happening. And I agree. I agree with your approach there. Uh, I do things that are rewarding for me, and I report on things, write about things, conduct interviews for YouTube like this one about things that I think people should know. And if it gets to a few people, well, I enjoy doing it, so I'm certainly not out anything.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts on your work and these articles we've discussed that you'd like to share with folks?
Well, I sure would encourage people along the line of what I guess we were just saying, to kind of spread the news, if you will. I do think it's important. Over and over again, I've put out what I think are important articles about aspects of our history that have either been suppressed or ignored for various reasons, and it just kind of goes nowhere. Only people, individuals, themselves, talking word of mouth, or publishing online, or tweeting it out, or whatever, putting on a Facebook, whatever. Well, I don't really want to promote Facebook here, but doing things that get people talking or thinking. It's everyone's responsibility. We all have a moral responsibility, right? No man is an island. That's how I was brought up to think. Each one is a piece of the main, a part of the whole. And we all have some kind of moral responsibility to truth, or to combat the forces of reaction. And that's what I see myself doing. I do enjoy, I've spoken to, I do enjoy aspects. I do enjoy the puzzle aspect of working through documents. I do enjoy learning more about the world. I even enjoy the surprises that I get, as sometimes as disturbing as they may be, because it means that I know more about where I come from. I mean, I was born in the midst of the height of the Cold War in the mid '50s, and you know, I look at that now and see how much that helped form my family, the culture I grew up in, and myself. So I'm learning about myself when I'm doing these things, and so I think that's important. And that people reading it or pursuing this, you're learning about the world we really live in. We're looking at outside of the in Plato's sense. We're looking not just at the flickering lights on the cave, but we're looking outside at the reality best we can. And that's
Yeah.
what I'm about. Yeah.
I have been talking with Dr. Jeffrey Kaye. You can find links to his work in the video description. Please share them. And thank you so much for joining me today, Dr.
Oh,
Kaye.
thank you so much, Jack. Anytime.